In the vast tapestry of biblical narratives, there is a moment that stands out with a peculiar and almost jarring clarity. It is a moment when God, the omnipotent and often distant deity of the Old Testament, appears not just human but almost needy. This moment is found in the book of Malachi, the last of the prophetic books, where God, through the prophet, complains about the quality of sacrifices and the lack of tithes. It is a scene that seems to contradict the grandeur and self-sufficiency of God, as depicted in earlier texts, and it raises profound questions about the nature of divine-human relationships and the evolution of religious practices. The transformation of God's character from the early books of the Hebrew Bible to the post-exilic period is a gradual and complex process. In the beginning, God is a distant creator who speaks to humanity through a series of covenants and commands. The covenant with Abraham is a prime example, where God promises land and descendants without requiring anything in return. This God is powerful, self-sufficient, and does not seem to need human worship or sacrifices. The focus is on the promise and the fulfillment of that promise, rather than on the rituals and offerings that would later become central to Israelite religion. However, as the narrative progresses, the requirements of God become more specific and demanding. The Exodus from Egypt and the giving of the law at Mount Sinai mark a significant shift. God now demands exclusive worship and adherence to a set of commandments, and the covenant is no longer a one-sided promise, but a bilateral agreement. The construction of the tabernacle and later the temple in Jerusalem becomes a central element of this new relationship. God's presence is now tied to a physical location, and the rituals of sacrifice and worship become essential to maintaining that presence. The construction of the temple by Solomon is a pivotal moment in this evolution. God accepts the temple as a dwelling place, but the conditions for its permanence are clear. If the people of Israel turn away from God and worship other gods, the temple will be destroyed. This conditional nature of the temple's existence is a stark contrast to God's earlier indifference to human architecture, as seen in the story of David's desire to build a temple. God tells David that he has never needed a house of cedar and has been content with a tent. Yet, when Solomon builds the temple, God consecrates it and promises to dwell there forever, provided the people remain faithful. The destruction of the temple by the Babylonians and the subsequent exile of the Judeans to Babylon further complicate this relationship. The temple, once a symbol of God's presence and the glory of the Davidic dynasty, is no more. The return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple, as described in the books of Haggai and Zechariah, are marked by a sense of disappointment and frustration. The new temple is a shadow of its former glory, and the people are struggling to rebuild their lives. God, through the prophets, attributes their struggles to their failure to prioritize the rebuilding of the temple. This is a surprising turn, given God's earlier statements about not needing a physical dwelling place. The situation becomes even more perplexing with the arrival of Zerubbabel, the Persian-appointed governor and a descendant of David. God, through Haggai, anoints Zerubbabel as a Messiah, a chosen servant who will bring about a new age of prosperity and glory. However, this promise is never fully realized. Zerubbabel, despite his royal lineage, is never addressed as a king, and is eventually overshadowed by the high priest, Joshua. The messianic hopes that were once tied to the Davidic line seem to fade away, leaving a sense of unfulfilled expectations. In the book of Malachi, this sense of disappointment and neediness reaches its peak. God, through the prophet, complains about the poor quality of sacrifices and the lack of tithes. The rhetoric of Malachi is strikingly different from the earlier prophets. God is no longer the all-powerful and self-sufficient deity, but a figure who feels neglected and dishonored. The complaint about the sacrifices, in particular, is a reversal of earlier prophetic messages. Isaiah, for example, famously declared that God was tired of the multitude of sacrifices and did not delight in the blood of animals. Malachi, on the other hand, seems to suggest that God is deeply concerned about the quality and quantity of the offerings. This shift in God's character is not just a literary device, but reflects a deeper change in the religious and social context of post-exilic Judah. The people are struggling to rebuild their lives and their community, and their relationship with God is marked by a sense of mutual need. God's demand for better sacrifices and tithes is a call for the people to recommit to their covenant and to prioritize their relationship with God. However, this demand also reveals a vulnerability in God's character, a sense that the divine presence and favor are not as secure as they once were. The image of God as a neglected and dishonored figure is further reinforced by the passage where God speaks of being a wife who has been deserted by her husband. This is a striking and almost shocking metaphor, as it reverses the traditional roles of God and Israel. In earlier texts, God is often portrayed as a husband who has been unfaithful to his wife, Israel. Here, God is the abandoned wife, and Israel is the husband who has been unfaithful. This metaphor suggests a deep emotional and relational dimension to the divine-human relationship, one that goes beyond the formal and legalistic aspects of the covenant. In conclusion, the transformation of God's character from a distant and self-sufficient deity to a needy and vulnerable figure is a complex and multifaceted process. It reflects the changing religious and social context of the Israelite people, from the early promises of the patriarchs to the struggles of the post-exilic period. This transformation is not a weakening of God's power, but a deepening of the divine-human relationship, one that is marked by mutual need and a shared desire for reconciliation and restoration.